It was a fascinating weekend in America, with the Grand Prix once again being dictated by strategy differentials at the Circuit of the Americas. It wasn't clear which driver would have the best approach coming towards the end of the race, as it went right down to the wire. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the US Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Norris takes 4 podiums in a row. After a few weekends where Oscar Piastri has pushed his teammate, Lando Norris reasserted his number 1 driver status at McLaren this weekend. The British driver qualified second and led the race into turn 1, and from there he was quickly able to prove the pace of the McLaren car with the recent upgrades. Within a lap, Lando Norris was more than a second ahead of Charles Leclerc, with the Monegasque driver outside of DRS range before DRS was even enabled. This shows what we already know. Norris is capable of holding a commanding lead when given the opportunity in Formula 1, and in his 100th race he's shown his capability to lead the Grand Prix and manage his pace when the tyre wear was significant in the heat of Texas. But even with Verstappen away back behind starting in 6th, it seemed inevitable that the Red Bull would be the top car and would find their way back to the front. The McLaren progress this year has been impressive, particularly due to the fact that they seem to have a car that can work at all circuit types. Norris seemed to be very happy with his ability to score podium finishes at each race, and this has become his 4th podium finish in a row and his 6th of the season in total. In the end, it was just 3rd for Lando Norris, as he was unable to keep the quick Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton behind towards the end, but given he didn't have 2 fresh sets of mediums and had to take 2 stints on the hard compound tyre, which wasn't the preferred option, it was a great weekend for him. Overall, it was a driver of the day performance and a great race from Norris, as he gets another green box from me today. Hamilton finds his form in America and tries to hunt the win. Lewis Hamilton tends to do very well around the Circuit of the Americas. The Mercedes driver is in the hunt for 2nd in the World Championship, as he has the potential to close up to Sergio Perez. This weekend, Hamilton has meant business. Not only is he in that fight, but the Mercedes team is also trying to ensure that they end up ahead of Ferrari in the constructor standings as well. In the sprints, Hamilton qualified 3rd and took 2nd off the line, with the British driver subsequently having a race in no man's land once Verstappen took off up ahead. But it was clear that in the hands of Hamilton, the Mercedes was in a very good place around this circuit. In the Grand Prix, Hamilton started 3rd once again, and despite losing a place to Sainz early on, he quickly made progress back past the Ferrari drivers to regain 2nd position. Again, in the hands of Hamilton, the Mercedes looked like a very quick car this weekend, with the 7-time champion finding a way to make it work despite not being 100% happy with his car in general this season. Once he cleared the Ferraris, Hamilton started to make his way towards Norris up ahead, showing that even with the laps in the dirty air and having to overtake the other drivers, he still had the tyre life to close up to the McLaren ahead. In the strategy department, it was Mercedes that opted to go longer into each stint with both of their drivers. Hamilton lost time to both Verstappen and Norris through the first stint, but as he was catching up to those drivers, they stopped again, with Mercedes always planning to ensure that Hamilton would have the tyre advantage in the final stint with a 2nd set of medium compound tyres, which would then have the pace at the end for Hamilton to attack the drivers ahead of him. This offset of strategy, particularly having a set of medium compound tyres at the end, gave Hamilton a significant advantage towards the end of the race, and it feels like if there were just a couple more laps in this Grand Prix, he might have been able to take the win away from Red Bull. But in the end, it wasn't to be. Instead, it was Hamilton who had a brilliant weekend in Austin, with one of his best races in a very long time. For me, it's got to be a green box for the British driver. Before we take a look at the fact that Red Bull triggered the strategy, I want to take a moment to quickly ask you to subscribe to Behind the Drive. I'm aiming for 60,000 subscribers before the end of the year, so if you can help with that goal, hit the subscribe button today. Red Bull trigger the strategy. F1 races at COTA tend to be dictated by the strategy. We've seen this on several occasions in the past, and this Sunday was no different, with the optimum approach being between a 1-stop and a 2-stop strategy. But equally, there was significant difference between the medium and hard compound tyres, with the medium certainly being the preferred choice in the race. The commentary early on was referring to lap 20 as being the optimum point where the drivers might be able to make the 1-stop work, but it was a few laps before then that Max Verstappen opted for the early pit stop and committed to the 2-stop race, with their 2nd stint being on the same tyre as the first. It was fascinating to see the Red Bull come in early, as the other teams seemed forced to quickly react to them, considering the undercut tends to be incredibly powerful at this circuit. It perhaps even dictated the strategy of other teams, particularly McLaren and Ferrari, as they responded on the following lap. Either way, it felt like the Red Bull team were always clear of the others on this occasion, with the race being closer than they would have expected, but still fairly comfortable for Verstappen to take the win and lead the majority of the race after his 6th in qualifying. Despite this, it seems like Verstappen was under more pressure at this race than we've seen for a long time. The Dutch world champion was frequently complaining about brake issues on the radio to his race engineer, and then getting frustrated with radio messages coming during the braking zones. This is something that we haven't seen often through the season, given how Red Bull has been so dominant at races this year. But with Verstappen starting out of position, they seem to be on a similar race pace to the McLaren of Lando Norris and the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton. This was unusual, but a good sign of things to come for the rest of the year, and perhaps even into next season, given they seem to be very close. On this occasion, Hamilton and Norris's teammates were not up there with them, but once again, Perez wasn't there to support Verstappen in this fight either. This is a real concern, and perhaps another reason why Red Bull seems to be considering the future of their second driver. In the end, despite managing those brake issues, Verstappen secured the win and didn't end up facing much of a challenge despite Hamilton chasing him down with a few laps to go. But it's got to be a green box for Verstappen as he managed to make it work to take his 50th win in Formula 1. A sprint race solution. We've had several excellent sprint races in 2023. This has often been caused by drivers being out of position or weather conditions. But this weekend, the sprint race was a bit boring. Verstappen took sprint pole and then went on to win the race pretty comfortably by almost 10 seconds in just 19 laps. Hamilton was behind and was well ahead of Leclerc in third, but the race itself was pretty boring. There were not many overtakes, and in hindsight it was pretty clear that this track wouldn't be well suited for a sprint race. As I mentioned earlier, this track works best when strategy plays a factor. It tends to have significant tyre wear with the hot conditions and several high-speed corners. This is something that is never going to be well suited for a sprint race. You either want there to be a close option between two tyre compounds like we had in Qatar, or you need the weather to play a factor, or perhaps even have a mixed up grid, and we didn't have any of those this weekend. Once again, whenever we have a disappointing sprint, people want changes. The sprint race is still a new format for Formula 1, and clearly the sports owners are trying new things with this format each year. One solution that regularly comes up is the one that Carlos Sainz is a fan of, and it's to set the sprint grid as the reverse of the championship order. This would guarantee that there would be overtakes, as the quicker drivers would be making their way through the backmarkers, and it would give the drivers in the backmarker teams an opportunity to hold on for some points. It sounds like a great idea in my opinion, and I'd love to see it play out. However, it feels very unlikely to be allowed to happen. I think the teams wouldn't want to have reverse grids, given the concerns of incidents and accidents as these cars come through the field. In addition, the concerns of championship points being more likely to be given to drivers further down the order is also an issue. It would take away from the meritocracy of Formula 1, where the best teams and drivers get the advantage. On the whole, it's got to be a red box for the sprint this weekend. It's to be expected given the fact that this circuit is one that tends to produce good racing with strategy being the key factor. So it's a disappointing call from F1 to host a sprint here, but I still believe in the format, particularly for fans at the circuit. Aston Martin head back to the drawing board. Aston Martin's season since the summer break has been relatively disappointing, and this weekend saw one of their worst races of 2023. The team brought an upgrade package to their car this weekend, which gave them less time to adapt and set up the car, given it was for a sprint. The single practice session was clearly not enough for the team, as both drivers dropped out of qualifying in Q1, with Alonso failing to make it to Q3 for the first time this season. There's always risk associated with bringing an upgrade on a sprint weekend, but Aston Martin's closest rival right now in McLaren has certainly done that at points this year, and so if the team has confidence in their upgrade and knowledge of their optimum setup, they can certainly make it work. There is a concern for Aston Martin more generally. The team clearly haven't made the upgrade work on this occasion, and after this dreadful qualifying, the team even opted to change the floor back to the old specification in the race for Fernando Alonso, and the new spec was kept on for Lance Stroll. The team insisted that the new parts have been working as expected, but to take this approach implies that they were working to learn more about their new setup and try to use the Grand Prix as a bit of a test session this afternoon, rather than taking advantage of the potential pace improvements that they could get from the new upgrades. Whilst the team's comments suggest that they are happy, their actions say otherwise, and this is why it isn't clear what they were trying to achieve by making these upgrades this weekend. Generally, the team is off the pace compared to where they've been in the early part of the year, as the team seemed to head in the wrong direction in terms of their development earlier on. Aston Martin is now dropped behind McLaren in the Constructors' Championship, which is a shame to see, and despite Stroll scoring 2 points for 9th position with a good drive from the pit lane, it still isn't enough for the team. Aston Martin's going back to the drawing board and will have to hope that these upgrades can reward the team with better results going into the final races of the 2023 season. So it's got to be an amber box for Aston Martin. The team did manage to score those couple of points, but it really isn't close to their rivals at the front. Honourable mentions. Yuki Tsunoda's race was excellent in his AlphaTauri as he managed to take 10th position, but also he went for the late pit stop to secure the fastest lap as well. These 2 points came while Daniel Ricciardo was the last of the finishers this weekend after making 3 pit stops in the race. It was a good race from Tsunoda as he continued to show he's capable of points and can finish ahead of his more experienced teammate. Overall, it was a race where it was close to the front once again, so it'll be interesting to see what happens next in Mexico, which is typically a circuit that tends to be very difficult for some teams.